Hey everyone, welcome back to another lecture. Last time we continued talking about the American Revolution, right, by discussing the Black Patriots and how they fought for the American side in a couple different ways, right, through couple different regiments, whether they sort of did things like defensively or sort of did the grunt work or they fought, right, in general, and how after the war, um, the situation for African slaves didn't really change, right? We're going to sort of start getting into that today. We also discussed James Forten and how he served on a French ship when he was a teenager and how he was a successful businessman afterwards. And we also talked about Phyllis Wheatley, who published her poetry book when she was still a slave and sort of um, wrote some famous poems to King George III and to George Washington, and just demonstrating that a black enslaved woman could be smart. Right? Speaking of a black person who's smart, today we're going to start by talking about Benjamin Banneker. Now, you saw from the description of this lecture before you clicked on this that this will be the end of our fourth PowerPoint, and we're going to move on to the fifth PowerPoint today, which is a pretty short PowerPoint, so we're going to cover most of the fifth PowerPoint today. All right. So this is just some little tidbits about Benjamin Banneker if you want to pause and read that. Otherwise, we're going to move on. And this is like a drawing of him, a depiction of what he looked like. If you take a look at video A, you may notice that we don't have that many videos today, which is fine because some of this is purely conceptual. But if you take a look at video A, it is a short biography on Benjamin Banneker, which not a lot of people know about him, so that's why I like teaching about him in this class. For all you future scientists out there. So Benjamin Banneker was born on November 9th, 1731 in Baltimore County, Maryland. Both of his parents were free. His father was a former slave from Guinea. I always like having a hard time pronouncing it. Guinea, Guinea. Some historians claim that his mother came from a white indentured servant and an African slave. Banneker spent his early formative years working on his family's farm, studying astronomy, and trying to publish his first almanac in 1790, though he had no printer. Essentially, what an almanac is, for those of you who may not have grandparents that had almanacs, they basically are mostly for farmers. That's what they call farmers' almanacs, keeping track of like what the seasons are going to look like in the year, when harvest seasons are, the phases of the moon, the tides in the ocean, like scientifically keeping track of those things so you can sort of plan out your year. Ben Franklin published some almanacs as well. In February 1791, Banneker was recruited by Major Andrew Ellicott, who was tasked with surveying a new federal district by Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. Surveying, okay, so to define surveying, it basically means that you plot out a city, right? So Thomas Jefferson, in accordance with what President Washington sort of agreed upon, believed that they needed to plot a city that would be the capital of the new United States, right, in the new country. Every country has a capital. So Benjamin Banneker was recruited to help them plan out what eventually became Washington, D.C. So the original land that became the District of Columbia, that's what D.C. stands for if you didn't know, was originally 10 square miles on each side, with Ellicott's team placing boundary marking stones near every mile point. So they'd kind of count the miles and then put a large stone. Sometimes people did it with wooden poles or stakes, right? And that sort of marks the general boundary of where you want to build the city. Banneker was primarily responsible for using astronomical observations at a location in Alexandria, Virginia, which is very close to D.C., in order to determine where the team needed to start. So he actually looked at the stars and determined, based on the stars and astronomy in general, where they should plot DC. which is pretty cool, right? Don't ask me to get into specifics because even though as a kid I wanted to be an astronomer, I am not a scientist. He also kept a clock which he used to relate points on the ground to places in the sky that he had observed. Because he was 59 years old at the time and became very ill, Banneker left the survey after 3 months, so he wasn't there for that long. After he returned to his family farm, Banneker used his predictions of eclipses and planetary conjunctions, meaning two places have the same sort of ellipses, right? They move sort of in a similar way, to create a 6-year series of almanacs. His almanacs, published in 1792, were titled Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia Almanac and Ephemeris. Okay, that was the formal title. They also included, like many almanacs, a side table for the Chesapeake region. Okay, here's Banneker when he was older. His friend James McHenry, one of the signers of the U.S. Constitution, wrote in the 1795 Philadelphia edition the following poem. Okay, so I'm going to show you that poem real quick. We'll definitely come back to this information. Okay, so this is what his friend wrote sort of in the foreword of the almanac. Basically, generally in a foreword, somebody else writes something on your behalf, right? Sort of either explaining who you are as a person or why the work that you just wrote is so important. So his friend said, "Long may thou live, an evidence to shew that Afric's sable race have talents too, and may thy genius bright its strength retain, though nature to decline may still remain, and may favor us till thy latest years with thy ephemeris called Bannekers, a work which ages yet unborn shall name, and be the monument of lasting fame, a work which after ages shall adore, when Banneker, alas, shall be no more." So basically what he was saying is like, even I know my friend Benjamin Banneker's from Africa and we think African people aren't too smart, but he proves that nope, you can be really smart, and that this almanac is something that people will talk about and use for years. So it's sort of like a compliment, but slightly backhanded compliment, I don't know. Okay, let's continue with our information. Banneker recorded his scientific observations in a series of journals where he wrote about his dreams, his diary, mathematical calculations, and puzzles. Only one journal survived after a fire on the day of his funeral incinerated the rest. So who knows if someone set that fire, but basically it burned up most of the information he recorded. Who knows what kind of things he could have discovered or invented that would have helped out society. It just sucks. He published some anti-slavery speeches and writings from both England and America in his almanacs. On August 19, 1791, he wrote to Thomas Jefferson pleading for justice for Black Americans. He even accused Jefferson of using fraud and violence to oppress his slaves. So he basically called out Thomas Jefferson and said, "You're a hypocrite, you own slaves, blah, blah, blah." We'll take a look at their exchanges after we're done with this information, because I always think it's very interesting. Banneker never married. The last of his almanacs were published in 1797 after declining sales. He died in his log cabin on October 9, 1806, at the age of 74, after years of chronic alcoholism. One of his greatest accomplishments, the survey of our nation's capital, is considered to be a myth, as there is lack of sufficient evidence to definitively prove that it happened. So we can't prove that it happened, and we can't prove that it didn't happen. Okay, so what I just told you, part of that, right, him surveying DC, we're unsure. But that's the thing about history, though, is like we have to sort of roll with things that maybe we're not completely unsure of, but that sound kind of accurate, right? It's like the same with scientific theory. It's a theory because you want to prove it, but maybe you can't necessarily prove it. That's why it's called a theory, right? All right. So I'm going to do Banneker's correspondence to Jefferson first, then Jefferson's response, and I think Banner responding to him. Okay, so in August 19, 1791, which, by the way, Jefferson wrote a lot of letters. Like, we have a lot of letters he wrote to his friends, family, etc. So he's a very prolific writer. Banneker said, "Sir, how pitiable is it to reflect that although you were so fully convinced of the benevolence of the Father of mankind, aka God, and of his equal and impartial distribution of those rights and privileges which he had conferred upon them, that you should at the same time counteract his mercies, and detaining by fraud and violence so numerous a part of my brethren, under groaning captivity and cruel oppression, that you should at the same time be found guilty of that most criminal act which you professedly detested in others with respect to you yourselves." He's calling him out, right? He's saying, how dare you say freedom and justice and all this stuff when you own all these slaves? Like, what about that? You're a hypocrite. Oh, I don't have Banneker's response to Jefferson, right? I thought I did. Never mind. But this is sufficient enough to tell you how this went. So Jefferson, this is what he responded to Banneker on August 30th, 1791. He said, "Sir, I thank you sincerely for your letter of the 19th, instant and for the almanac it contained. Nobody wishes more than I do to see such proofs as you exhibit that nature has given to our black brethren talents equal to those of the other colors of men, and that the appearance of a want of them is owing merely to the degraded condition of their existence both in Africa and America. I can add with truth that nobody wishes more ardently to see a good system commenced for raising the condition both of their body and mind to what it ought to be, as fast as the imbecility of their present existence and other circumstance, which cannot be neglected, will admit. I have taken the liberty of sending your almanac to Monsieur de Condorcet, Secretary of the Academy of Sciences at Paris, and member of the Philanthropic Society, because I considered it as a document to which your whole color had a right for their justification against the doubts which have been entertained of them. I am with great esteem, sir, your most obedient, humble servant, Thomas Jefferson." So he didn't answer shit about it, right? He basically was like, "Oh yeah, I liked your almanac and I thought it was great. I sent it to my friend in Paris. Like, he thinks it's cool too. And I think it's great that you're smart and you can prove black people are smart." Said nothing about the fact that he owned slaves himself, right? Thomas Jefferson did not acknowledge what Benjamin Banneker said. Now, these days we would call that gaslighting, right? Basically, if you have an argument with someone, say like someone stole your pencil and you were like, "Hey, you stole my pencil, that's not cool." And then they were like, "Well, the other day, like, you said something kind of mean to me and I don't think that's right. What do you have to say about that?" That's gaslighting because they're redirecting the argument and not taking personal responsibility, right? So, interesting. So that's it for the fourth PowerPoint. Let's move on to the fifth. In this PowerPoint, which I mentioned is very brief, we're going to finish it next time, we talk about the United States Constitution, right? The Constitution is the basis of our country. You guys will learn this, if you're not already learning it, in your senior year in government, right? But it's important to understand the Constitution, especially with regards to this class, because it not only set up this country, but it also set up slavery for years to come when they had the opportunity to get rid of slavery. This is the Second Continental Congress, right? They were led by George Washington. So they were a bunch of lawyers and stuff, pretty much the same guys mostly that wrote and signed the Declaration of Independence. They came together even before the Revolutionary War was over to sort of plan out what this new democratic country would look like, because this is the first democratic country in the world, so it was a huge experiment for people, right? Washington actually wanted to retire. He was kind of sick of politics and war and all this stuff, but they kind of they forced him to come back and become the first president, right? So, just as a brief explanation, the Constitution is not the first constitutional document we've had in this country. During the war, we had the Articles of Confederation, which basically was a very loose document that encouraged the states to work together. But we didn't force any taxes on anybody. We allowed the states to dictate a lot of what they wanted individually. So we didn't really have a central government. That's why the Second Continental Congress threw out the Articles of Confederation and they adopted the new Constitution. Okay. If you want to learn more about this, you can take History 17A, which is a early American history course. And I personally go into more detail about the differences between the two. Okay, so here's a copy of the Constitution, and here is slavery sort of superimposed onto it. So first we are going to discuss the words slave and slavery and why, even though slavery is in the Constitution, the words are not. Okay, so let's get into it. You're probably like, what the heck? So here is a really popular picture the abolitionists used. They said, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Right? This was circulated quite largely during this time. So the Founding Fathers were left to devise how they were going to shape their new republic. This took the form of the drafting of the Constitution in September 17th, 1787. This was a big change from the Articles of Confederation, which operated as our impromptu first constitution during the Revolution. The main difference between the two was that while the Articles of Confederation focused more on states' rights, the Constitution focused on federal rights, which meant tying the states together under one central government. And that's the way it's been ever since. Of course, this meant that our government was split into three main bodies: the judiciary, right, aka the Supreme Court, the highest court in our country; executive, which is the president and his or her cabinet of professionals; and congressional, which means Congress, right, our representatives, the people who are supposed to fight on behalf of each local community in this country. These bodies were not only responsible for carrying out their own unique tasks, but also checking the balance of power amongst each other, so as not to have one dominant faction over all others. So again, in early American history, I get more into this, and you'll learn this in government, but basically what we do is we have each branch of government is designed to check the other branch of government so that nobody has more power than the other person, right? The Supreme Court can shoot down something that the president and Congress agreed upon, right? The president can veto something that Congress passed, which means that he or she can get rid of it or try to get rid of it. And Congress has the power to pass things that check the president, or they also have the power to help appoint the Supreme Court judges. So as you can see, it's supposed to be a workable system where no one branch of government is more powerful than the other. Although they did want Congress to be the most powerful because they're supposed to represent each of us. So they were very paranoid that their new government would reflect their former British overlords. So what did this mean for Black Americans? Well, much like the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution really didn't have anything for them. In fact, it mostly focused on white men. The Founding Fathers were so focused on getting the Constitution drafted that they made several concessions for Southern slaveholders, even though some of the founders were against slavery. Ben Franklin was an example, right? We talked about before how he and John Adams, with the Declaration, were like, we need to get rid of slavery, it's terrible, blah, blah, blah. But you have people like Jefferson and Washington who have a bunch of slaves, right? Or the Southern states who they needed to preserve slavery, right, in order to keep the Southern states in the U.S. The words slave and slavery do not appear in the Constitution, although it is deeply embedded within the document. So real quick, I'm going to go to a quote, and then I'll come right back. So Luther Martin, one of the delegates at the formation of the Constitution, said of Article 1, Section 9, the design of this clause is to prevent the general government from prohibiting the importation of slaves, but they anxiously sought to avoid the admission of expressions which might be odious in the ears of Americans, although they were willing to admit into their system those things which the expressions signified. And we'll talk about that as well, right? How the Constitution sort of got rid of the slave trade, but not really. But the fact that they didn't even want to call it the slave trade, Martin had an issue with. Okay, let's go back. All right. So this points to the shame that some of the founding fathers felt towards the institution of slavery, preferring to omit the language outright, rather than own up to the inhumanity of slavery. And there was also no mention of slavery in the Articles of Confederation. So rather than Jefferson and everybody admitting, like, we own slaves and this sucks, but we want slavery anyways, they just wanted to ignore the problem, right? Which isn't good. So slavery was the economic backbone of the South, as I mentioned before. Southern planters depended heavily on slave labor in order to grow important cash crops. Without slavery, the Southern economy would have collapsed, as slave labor was the much cheaper option than hiring field workers. The Northern founders feared that if they did not make concessions on slavery, then the South may have formed their own nation. So people seem to think that the South didn't leave until the Civil War, right? But they've always wanted to leave. Since even before this country was formed, the South wanted to be their own entity because they depended so much on slavery, right? So that's something I want you to take away from this class too, is the fact that the Civil War was always going to happen. It just took a lot longer than maybe it could have to happen, right? Slavery was always going to have to end at some point. Okay. So next thing we're going to talk about is a clause that dealt with the fact that we had to charge the states taxes, but we also had to count all of the slaves that they owned. Okay. Some of you may be familiar with the Three-Fifths Compromise. That's what we're going to talk about, right? This is sort of a diagram showing how white individuals were counted in the government versus black slaves. Okay, so let's take a look at that. Video B is Crash Course History. Crash Course History is made by YouTuber John Green, who wrote several books. He and his brother created VidCon, the YouTube convention, but he does Crash Course History series where they talk about history and sort of sum it up, right, very concisely and make jokes and stuff. In this Crash Course History and Video B, they talk about constitutional compromises, right, what we're talking about now, and they do talk about the Three-Fifths Compromise. So here's another diagram sort of showing what three-fifths look like in another way. So the Three-Fifths Compromise began with an amendment that was proposed to the Articles of Confederation on April 18, 1783, which wanted to determine the taxes that were proposed for each state based on population. And that's generally what we do, right? The state collects a certain amount of money based on how many people live there. And they also have to pay a certain amount of money to the government based on how many people live there. Right? Now we have a lot more individual taxes, like property, income, all that stuff. But back then, right, if you had more people living there, the state had to pay more. Okay. Southern delegates were opposed to the amendment as they would have to pay more taxes than other states because their slaves would be counted, right, even though their slaves couldn't vote. Benjamin Harrison of Virginia proposed counting the slaves as only 1/2 of a person, while the New Englanders proposed counting them as 3/4 of a person. However, slaves were ultimately counted as 3/5, thanks to James Madison's recommendation. James Madison is the 4th president of the U.S., and he also wrote the Constitution. The amendment fell short of getting the votes needed to be added to the Articles of Confederation. During the drafting of the Constitution, however, abolitionist delegates were opposed to counting slaves with regards to state populations, not only because slaves could not vote, okay, don't say slaves could vote, but also because doing so would have given the southern states an advantage with regards to representation. Okay. Now, I'm trying to stress the fact that you shouldn't say slaves could vote, because every semester I teach this, no matter how many times I say they couldn't vote, a student writes in their exam that they could vote. Like every semester, you can see here how frustrated I am, but it's like they couldn't vote. Like not until years later, so never ever put that. Okay, just save yourself some points. Doing so would have boosted the representation that southern states had in the Electoral College, which would have given the southern elite more power with regards to presidential elections. So this was the conundrum, right? The North wanted to tax the crap out of the South, right? Maybe in an effort to get rid of slavery, but they didn't want to count all the slaves because then the South would have way more delegates in Congress, but they would have less people voting against their interests, right? Because that's how it works, right? Each state, with regards to the House of Representatives, gets a certain amount of delegates based on how many people live there. So California is one of the states that have the most. Okay. Now the South wanted more representation, obviously, so they could control the government, but they didn't want to pay all those taxes. So that's where 3/5 was a compromise, right? Both sides had to give up something. So the alternative to this being passed was that the southern states either left the United States or were able to count their slaves as complete people. So the North was kind of losing either way. And here's what the 3/5 compromise looks like. In the Constitution, it is Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states, which shall be included within this union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. So again, they don't use the word slave, although we all know it's slave, right? Bound people for a number of years are the indentured servants, right? And then 3/5 of all other persons, like who's the other people besides Native Americans, indentured servants, white people, free blacks, etc., right? Okay, another sort of example of 3/5 as well. In regards to taxation, pro-slavery delegates wanted more representation but less taxes, as I mentioned, right? Anti-slavery is vice versa. So that's sort of the general argument. The impact in favor of the southern states upon the House of Representatives was noticeable. For example, in 1793, the southern states had 47 of the 105 members, but would have had 33 had seats been assigned based on free populations. As I mentioned before, because the southern states had ample representation, not only were they able to affect the presidential elections, but also the speakership of the House and the Supreme Court. So this is what's dangerous about this, right? If a certain group has enough delegates, right, they have enough people for the Electoral College, which is half of the total votes that we have for president, right? They have more representation in Congress, which means they have Speaker of the House. Speaker of the House is, like, some of you might be confused if you've never taken government. They're basically when one political party has majority in the House of Representatives in Congress, then they appoint somebody to be Speaker of the House. And actually, that person is the third in line to become president. So if the president and the vice president die, the Speaker of the House is president. Our current Speaker of the House is Nancy Pelosi of the Democratic Party. So that shows you how powerful the position is. And the Supreme Court, right? Supreme Court judges serve for life. So if you have control over Congress, then you have control over who's appointed to the Supreme Court, right? And if you have control of the president, by the way. And those appointments will last years. So very, very important. Without the Three-Fifths Compromise, Thomas Jefferson probably would not have won his election in 1800, remember, because he relied on the Southern vote. Slavery would have been excluded from Missouri, which we'll talk about later. Andrew Jackson's Indian removal policy would have failed, and that was when President Jackson moved Native Americans from the Southeast to Oklahoma, and many died during the Trail of Tears, so that might not have happened. The Wilmot Proviso, which we'll talk about later on, would have banned slavery in territories that we won from Mexico. And the Kansas-Nebraska bill, which we'll also talk about, would have failed, which sort of allowed the two states to decide if they're going to be slave states or not, and that caused a lot of bloody battles over it. Our good friend Alexander Hamilton, which I don't know if you guys have seen Hamilton on Disney Plus yet, but well, you probably have because I'm recording this in the summer, but whatever. So Hamilton said, "Much has been said of the impropriety of representing men who have no will of their own. They are men, though degraded to the condition of slavery. They are persons known to the municipal laws of the states which they inhabit, as well as to the laws of nature. But representation and taxation go together. Would it be just to impose a singular burden without conferring some adequate advantage?" So basically saying, like, you're going to count these men mostly, but also women and children, as 3/5 of people when they can't even vote, right? When they aren't citizens, they can't legally represent themselves. Hamilton says that's absolutely wrong. So our final topic for today is about capturing slaves. Right, I kind of mentioned before that Washington signed this into law where you were allowed to go and capture a slave that ran away, but this was formally written into the Constitution as well. Okay, so this is one example of an advertisement. Right, kidnappers in Boston. Men in Boston, one of your fellow citizens was last night seized by slave hunters. Assemble without arms in front of the State House. So this is sort of like the abolitionists in Boston saying, like, oh my God, slave hunters are kidnapping people. We need to assemble and tackle this issue. So this is called the Fugitive Slave Clause, and we will talk about the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 later on when we get more towards the Mexican-American War. So our last video for today is video C, which is a little bit more info on this clause because it's very important, right? It established sort of bounty hunters or individuals who could go and capture slaves and get money for it. So the Fugitives from Labor Clause, which we call the Fugitive Slave Clause, remember they didn't say slave in the Constitution, is found in Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3 of the Constitution. Let's go to that real quick. It says, "No person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service of labor, but shall be delivered up on the claim of the party to whom such service of labor may be due." Basically, in a roundabout way, saying if your slave escapes, you have the right to go get him, without saying slave. Okay, let's continue. So, the person held to slave service or labor contextually, of course, means a slave, apprentice, or indentured servant who must be returned to their owner if they attempt to run away. So even the indentured servants who probably were treated badly during their contract ran away as well. So they could be captured. Before the American Revolution, there generally were no laws that required British sovereign states to return escaped slaves. However, as we discussed before, in 1772, a British ruling determined that slaves who ran to a territory where they could be free could not be returned to their former owners. Although, as we know, this did not really apply to the American colonies in the Caribbean. Under the Articles of Confederation, there were no laws that required free states to return escaped slaves, although there were extradition clauses for escaped criminals. Extradition means that you could acquire somebody from another territory that broke the law, right? We have extradition treaties with various other countries. So if somebody killed somebody, for example, or ran away to one of these countries, the country would help us capture and bring back that person. However, this wasn't really a big problem in America, as only Vermont and Massachusetts had completely outlawed slavery by 1787. Vermont was the first state to do that. Although the Fugitive Slave Clause was never repealed from the Constitution, the passage of the 13th Amendment made it moot. Okay, so here's the thing I want to explain now before I get to Reconstruction at the end of this class. So we don't take things out of the Constitution. All the things I talked about are still in that document that you can view if you go to DC. What you do is you pass something that makes that clause, amendment, whatever, irrelevant, right? So later on we passed the 13th Amendment, which freed all the slaves and indentured servants, which means that the Fugitive Labor Clause or Slave Clause doesn't work anymore because we passed this amendment that said they're free. So that's what I mean, right? So all of these things are still on the books. We still have this in the Constitution, but these things just don't apply anymore. As far as the Atlantic slave trade, the source of new slaves at that point in time, it would go on in America for another 20 years. And we're going to talk about that next time. Okay, so here's an example, this picture of an escaped slave. They usually didn't have as much stuff on their back to take with them because you left during the night and didn't want to necessarily get caught. So again, this is the end of this lecture. Next time we are going to finish the 5th PowerPoint by talking about how they kind of sort of got rid of the slave trade, and I'll explain what I mean by that. And then we will begin PowerPoint 6 by talking about the northern states and how after the Revolution was over, how they gradually began to free their slaves.